So let's get to some of those movies, because I think this
Sure.
is such an interesting topic for people, is how you've pointed out Da Vinci Code, you've pointed out National Treasure, and your book is, it literally has Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, and, there's so many films where you point out the archetypal nature of the story and oftentimes the symbolism caught up in it. And I think, one of the more interesting films for me symbolically is Back to the Future, because people have started to point out, there's a lot of 9/11 symbolism in Back to the Future, right? And this, of course, was done in '85, and yet you've got, we don't have to go into all of it, but the point is that if you just look at the Twin Pines Mall where the terrorist attack against Doc Brown occurs and he's killed, Twin Pines Mall, Marty arrives there at 116 upside down is 9/11. When he comes back from the past to change the future, it's now One Pine Mall. The Twin Towers have become one tower. I mean, that's one of many little symbols of 9/11 in that film. In your book, you get more into the aspect of the Oedipal archetype of the story, right? Of the young man who's being lured into ultimately, sleeping with his mother and has to basically avert that in order to avert tragedy for himself, right? His non-existence.
Right, and then you have that, and then you also have the concept of the Egyptian solar family being retold in this, and you have a lot of solar iconography. The whole thing with the the mall is explained in the book. I don't really. I know I understand what you're saying, but I really don't think that would be. I guess people want to see a 9/11 reference. I would probably shy away from it. It's when he goes to the mall and Doc Brown says to him, this is at the beginning of part one, he said, old man Peabody had this crazy idea about breeding pine trees. And when Marty goes back in time, he escapes the Libyan terrorists. He winds up at Peabody's farm, and Peabody tries to shoot him. It says so. If you watch the movie, it says Peabody's farm on his mailbox. Well, as Marty's fleeing in the Delorean, Peabody has the 2 pine trees that he's trying to breed bracketed off, and Marty runs over one of them and kills it. And he says, you'll actually hear Peabody say, you space bastard, you killed my pine. So of course, when he comes back, it's now Lone Pine Mall, the one pine tree being killed. But just to get into some of the esoteric symbolism with Back to the Future, you really have a whole kind of Egyptian retelling of the Osirian cycle with the solar family, with George McFly being sort of this Osirian sun god.
Hey, McFly! What do you think you're doing?
Biff.
Hey, I'm talking to you, McFly, you Irish bug.
Oh, hey, Biff. Hey, guys. How are you doing?
Yeah, you got my homework finished, McFly?
The family lives at Lion Estate, which is, Leo the Lion, which is the soul house of the sun. Then you've got his, Isis, the wife, being Lorraine. And of course, she'd be the virgin who gets confused with her solar child, Horus. This would be Marty McFly. And again, this would be, Horus's, comparative equivalent in Greco-Roman mythology would be Apollo, who drives the sun chariot, and this would be the solar Delorean. And the Delorean, of course, hits 88 miles an hour to activate it, to turn it into the sun chariot. This is why in 1955 it has to hit at 10:04. 10:04 is lightning has to strike the clock tower to activate the sun chariot. 10:04 is a reference to October 4th, which is the 277th day of the solar calendar, which means there are 88 days left in the year. This is why the sun chariot of Apollo, this comes straight out of Jewish mysticism.
Stella!
Has to be activated at 88 miles. Then you've got the Hermes Trismegistus archetype, who is Doc Brown. Again, you tie in the solar lore. The sun family of Osiris, Isis, and Horus are of course opposed by this dark lord named Typhon. And you realize this is just a play on name of the name Tanin, who is Biff Tannen, who of course kills Osiris in part 2, but Osiris is ultimately resurrected, with the aid of Horus or Marty when he goes back in time to destroy the sports almanac. So you'll have this whole storyline going on, but then you have you have a lot of tarot embodiment with this, with the Hierophant card of the tarot, which is the 5th card. And if you read the Egyptian interpretation of this card by Aleister Crowley, he'll tell you that the 5th card is the master of time and space. And then again, we have this archetypical association with Doc Brown with the number 5. He invents time travel on November 5th, 1955. So you will find tarot embodiment with him. This comes off the Hierophant card. And again, these are the Jungian archetypes. You will find these archetypes in numerous movies. I talk about this in cinema symbolism. This is something I'm delving into in cinema symbolism too, which you pointed out at the top of the hour that is the sequel that I'm writing right now. So yeah, I mean, just a lot going on with Back to the Future. Back to the Future 2 has it. Zemeckis, I'm not going to prolong this much longer. I know you had other questions, but another thing that Zemeckis, who was the director, really plays around with in those movies is the location of buildings. Buildings located in 1985 will have a dualistic opposite meaning in 2015 or back in time in 1885. That's something he really plays around with. Another thing that he does that's really masterful in part one is, and again, this ties into going back to the future quite literally, is the opening sequence of Back to the Future. This is the first movie from 1985, is actually the end of the movie. If you pay attention to when they're going over Doc Brown's timepieces that he has, you'll find a little man hanging off one of the clock hands. And of course, this is foreshadowing Brown hanging off one of the clock hands at the end when the lightning's striking around him. And then you'll find a clock that it's a little wino who raises the bottle. And this, of course, is at the end of the movie with Red, the drunk that Marty encounters when he comes back. And then, of course, when the movie opens, Brown's alarm clock goes off, and you'll be entreated to a commercial for Statler Toyota. The Statler Toyota dealership plays out throughout the entire theme, throughout all three movies. They are the dealership that Marty gets his truck from at the end. At the beginning, when he's standing there with Jennifer, he says, "Look at that 4x4," and they cut to the car, and it says another 4x4 courtesy of Statler Toyota dealership. If you pay attention in part one, the dealership is located right across the street from the courthouse. When Marty goes back in time in 1885, and he first walks into Hill Valley, the first sign he says is horses bought, sold, and traded by honest Joe Statler, who is obviously an ancestor. So I mean, these guys are real masterful with playing around with this and putting it in your subconscious. And Back to the Future trilogy, out of all the chapters in the book in cinema symbolism, I would say that everybody, the most feedback I get is from the Back to the Future chapter and the Wizard of Oz, by far and away. I like a lot of the other chapters, but those are the two that everyone really seems to take the most out of.
Well, I'll come to Wizard of Oz too, because that's obviously there's a heavy issue with masonry and also mind control and MK Ultra accusations on it. But as far as Back to the Future goes, you pointing out all these direct correlations between the Egyptian royal family. You talk about Osiris, Set, Isis, and Horus, the sun, and makes me wonder. As you're reading all these, you're reading into all these films that you're watching, right? And are you thinking these artists, these directors, are tapping into a sort of a Jungian unconscious when they're making these films, or do you think, Zemeckis is a Mason and he's probably studied this, and this is very intentional? I mean, not just Zemeckis, but obviously, just across the board, there are filmmakers who are Masons, but it just feels to me almost as though there is an unconscious at work that's utilizing the medium of film and the way that Egypt was based on hieroglyphics, right, and the unconscious interplay with visuals that does go on when you watch something. So what is your take on that? Is how much of this is consciously driven? How much is just part of an unconscious universal mind that's utilizing the artist?
I think that's a fantastic question, and it's really the $1,000,000 question. And I get it asked all the time when I do shows. It's is this stuff being intentionally placed, or is it just seeping? Is it coincidental, or is it just seeping in there through you're correct, the collective unconscious? I think in most cases
Now we can watch
it is
Jackie
intentionally
Gleason while
placed.
we eat.
I believe these movie makers are masters with this stuff. I agree with you that a lot of them are very well versed in arcane mythology. Least we forget that in the heart of the movie making industry, we have Manly Palmer Hall's Philosophical Research Society, literally a stone's throw from Burbank, the heart of the Hollywood movie making machine and television making machine, because you'll find some of this in TV shows as well. So I do believe that they are aware of these unconscious archetypes, and that they are using this as bait to, I mean, Sean, they're just, printing money off this stuff. I mean, just to be, practical, it's mythology making is what they're doing. These movies are modern day mythology. I mean, I'm 43 years old. I mean, there is not a person in my generation, I guess I'm Generation X, who doesn't know Star Wars. I mean,
Who are you?
I mean, it's my generation's mythology.
My name
this is
is
irrefutable.
Darth
I mean,
Vader.
you listen to George Lucas talk, he'll tell you. I mean, I know because I have the book. You read a book like Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. I mean, the dust jacket has, a testimonial from Lucas saying on the book, this book is the inspiration for Star Wars. And, what does Campbell talk about? It's the solar journey. It's, if the sun's journey is if the hero with a thousand faces is the sun, this is his archetypical journey, is what Campbell is telling you. And this is what Lucas is utilizing. And again, we have the solar motifs with Osiris, Horus. So to answer your question, I do believe, that in most cases it's intentionally placed. I do believe a lot of these filmmakers are very cognizant of this material. That being said, I do believe in some instances you will find coincidences at hand. But I do believe it's being intentional. That being said, and I do document this in Cinema Symbolism, there are clear instances where you have a film director who was very ignorant of this material. And I talk about the main one I can think of is someone like Ed Wood, who was really, sort of like a B movie director and really had no knowledge of, Gnosticism or the ancient mysteries other than what he would have read in something like a movie trade book like Famous Monsters of Filmland, or watching a Universal, horror movie on, like The Mummy. That would have been the limit of his, prior knowledge of Egyptian mythology would have been The Mummy with Boris Karloff. So, I mean, but, you watch a movie, some of his early movies, you will clearly find Gnostic themes in this thing, and I talk about, we were talking about this, you talk about like a Gnostic demiurge. One of the greatest examples of this is Bela Lugosi and Glen or Glenda, and I'm absolutely 100% convinced that Wood had no knowledge of this. So then the question becomes, and it's a fair one to ask, well, how is this appearing? And what you're saying is correct, and I totally agree with you, is, these filmmakers and these, mythology makers are also subject to the collective unconscious. So, when they're making this stuff, they could also, they are being influenced on this unconscious level. And Wood clearly falls into that group. But to end the question, I do believe it's being intentionally placed.
But Lugosi was a master mason.
Oh, not to my knowledge. I don't.
There
are many.
The gesture, a lot of the hand gestures, would indicate that he either was an initiate or had studied it. I mean, I think that's clear with Lugosi. So if someone like Lugosi is at least aware of a lot of these things, then the question is, how much did he influence Wood, for example?
I mean, Lugosi could have definitely, having been in Dracula, I mean, could have been, known about some, ancient mythology. Obviously, he's Hungarian. I have no knowledge that Lugosi was a Freemason. I cannot pin that down. I will agree with you that a lot of Hollywood's golden age actors and directors were Freemasons. I know that, and I know this just recently came out, that the old Hollywood Masonic Lodge is still in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. This is where Jimmy Kimmel Live is being filmed right now. And there was a joke, someone would have to go back and look at this. I read it online, and the source material looked legitimate. It didn't look like someone was just putting it up. But Kimmel had actually joked about the Hollywood Masonic Lodge having this secret system of underground tunnels that ran underneath it to all the major Hollywood studios, where after the guys got done filming, whether it be a director, a producer, a writer, or actor, once they got done the movie, they could take this underground tunnel to the Masonic Lodge, which is now Jimmy Kimmel Live. And Jimmy Kimmel apparently confirmed this. He said in a monologue on one of his shows that there was this network of secret tunnels that ran under Los Angeles that were linked up to this Masonic temple, to all these major Hollywood, and television studios. According to him, the tunnels were in disarray and couldn't be used anymore. If you did, you could risk, the tunnel caving in on you, but apparently they were there. So I mean, I'm not going to come on here and say that a lot of Hollywood's golden age people were not Freemasons. They certainly were, but I've never been able to pin down Lugosi or anything like that. It's possible. I'd have to just go look it up for my own benefit.
We've talked a lot about the solar imagery, and I'm curious about what the Hanged Man symbol is from the tarot, because the end of the Dark Knight film, obviously Dark Knight referring to when the sun is at the lowest peak. That film has the Joker in the Hanged Man position.
Oh, absolutely.
What is that tarot meaning?
Well, right. That's really interesting. Is the Joker is the hanged man? The traditional interpretation of that card. And again, I'm just going on a traditional interpretation. I mean, I know there are interpretations that can vary during a reading if the card comes up inverted, not inverted. The Hanged Man is generally considered the Judas Iscariot card within the Rider-Waite deck, and numerous tarot card books talk about this. Is sort of the arch traitor archetype, the Judas Iscariot archetype. And of course, Judas hung himself, and of course, you have the Hanged Man hanging himself. You'll find this in the Ninth Gate movie, where the one person dies in the Hanged Man position. Although the esoterica seems to have somewhat been lost with. I mean, that movie contains a lot of esoteric imagery. That seems to have been more done for a theatrical reason. But I love the Hangman of Heath Ledger at the end of The Dark Knight. Of course, the arch traitor. This is, of course, Batman's arch enemy. And I mean, that definitely comes straight out of the tarot cards. The tarot embodiment, the arch traitor, the Hanged Man hanged by his foot. I mean, if you look at the Joker hanging there, Heath Ledger, I mean, there you have an example of tarot embodiment in a major motion picture. I mean, you'll have a lot of mythology. This is something I delve into in the book, and I'm just going to keep it brief, but you have a ton of mythology coming into the Batman movies, and a lot of this with superheroes in general. I mean, I'm just going into Batman. I mean, you have Two-Face, which is the Roman god Janus. I mean, of course, you have the trickster female, Lilith, which is Catwoman. Then you have Batman, who serves as his own sort of wisdom figure, which is Batman, which is the shadow self of Bruce Wayne. So, I mean, yeah, you have with Batman, you'll find this in a lot of superhero mythology, a lot of Greco-Roman, Egyptian mythology coming in. Superman, you have the savior archetype. The hero sent by the only begotten son sent to mankind to save itself from itself. I mean, where does that sound familiar? So yeah, I mean, a lot of archetypes and savior figures and mythology coming into superhero legend and lore from the tarot, from mythology, from the Jungian archetypes. Definitely, the Hanged Man, Heath Ledger, is one of them.
So now, in terms of the Hanged Man, in Back to the Future, you have two Hanged Men. First, you have Doc Brown straight up when he's hanging there from the clock tower, right? And he's not inverted, right? That's the first time. The second Hanged Man is in the sequel. When you're Osiris, you say that the father of Marty McFly is the Osiris figure, right? When we first see him in the future, he's hanged upside down in a machine, right? Remember, he's upside down. And
that's right.
And that's a very bizarre scene, because in that scene we see Marty McFly dressed in drag as playing his own daughter.
Right.
Michael J. Fox playing his own daughter. We have the father who's hanged upside down. And on the TV, just going back to 9/11 references, which is why I think this series is so interesting for the 9/11 aspect, is that there is the World Trade Center on the TV in the background. And the TV, it does have a snow where, kind of rolls up, and the World Trade Center rolls up to the top of the frame and then recalibrates. Now, if you were looking at it from the point of view of the father, it would look like the towers just came down into that snow, which is exactly what we saw in 2001. This was shot back in 85, 86 time period. So I think that's intriguing because, again, it's from the point of view of the Hanged Man, who was the father in that scene, upside down. Now, the other thing is people online are really abuzz about, which is why is it that we get all this drag? If you basically Google almost any celebrity, you will find them either playing a role in some kind of drag, even in the most random cases, like in Magic Mike when Channing Tatum shows up in a wedding dress. Or like, Michael J. Fox playing his daughter in, Back to the Future too, which you could say is funny, but at the same time really kind of strikes you as odd. But we've seen that, we've seen this quite often. What is that in terms of your interpretation of symbolism?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, Sean, it's not something I've really ever looked into. It's not a subject matter in cinema symbolism that I've ever taken on. So, it's an interesting subject. It sounds interesting, but it was something I would, before I would want to give you an answer that I was confident on, it's something I would definitely have to look more into.
Right. But just in terms of the nature of mysticism or archetypes, is there anything you could compare it to?
Not off the top of my head. Again, it's something I'd have to look into, and right now I can't say that I'd be comfortable giving an answer on that. I have no chapter about that in any of the books or anything like that. So it's something that I would definitely have to do more research on to give an answer that I'd be real comfortable with.
So let's talk about The Wizard of Oz. One of the most interesting blatant displays of masonry I ever saw was at the Oscars 2014. Where when they aired the Oscars for, 2014, normally it's called the Academy Awards. From my recollection, it's always the Academy Awards. 2014, it was always the Oscars. Every commercial break was Oscars. It wasn't Academy Awards. And the Oscars, the A was a pyramid, very clearly. And during that Oscar ceremony, Whoopi Goldberg came on stage dressed as, I believe, a fellow craft. But she had basically the noose around her neck, right, in a very Masonic-looking garb, apron, and just a costume that really struck me as inappropriate for the Oscars. I don't know if you saw it, but she basically
No, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it.
And she has a noose around her neck, and it was supposed to be a necklace, but it looked like a noose. It didn't look like a necklace. And then she very provocatively raised her right pant leg to reveal her ruby slippers, right?
Right.
And then she was initiating or beginning the, I think it was a Somewhere Over the Rainbow song, but it was a song from The Wizard of Oz. And it was just very blatantly a Masonic garb and opening to The Wizard of Oz. Now, why don't you talk a little bit about what is The Wizard of Oz in terms of the mythology involved in it? Many people have pointed out the nature of the battle for gold and silver. Originally, she was right in the original story. Dorothy has, it's not ruby slippers, it's silver slippers, right, that you're supposed to be able to click to go home. She walks in the yellow brick road, which is gold, right, and then the Emerald City, which is dollars, which is green, which is where the wizard lives. Basically, this is all fake. This is a concoction. It's very much like the dollar itself, which is a mystical symbol, right, full of occult imagery, including an Illuminati owl tucked away there on the dollar bill. So what's your take on The Wizard of Oz?
Right. Well, the Wizard of Oz. There's really three levels of symbolism going on in that story. And one would be sort of what you would call your profane explanation. This is the profane explanation for the vulgar masses, to use Albert Pike's own terminology. This would be just this is a story about a girl who gets whisked away to a magical land, has an adventure, meets three eccentric travelers, topples an evil witch, and then returns home. Story over. Happy ending. Then you have, which you're talking about, is the political allegory. That the Wizard of Oz is a allegory politically from I guess I want to say around 1895 to around 1905 of the United States of America. I should point out, the guy who authored The Wizard of Oz was a man named L. Frank Baum, who was in Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy Society. And what that was this mystical organization. Madame Blavatsky was this very mystical Russian woman who founded this group called Theosophy. To make a long story real short, Baum and his wife were involved with it. And again, just because of time constraints, it's essentially neo-Gnosticism, for lack of a better word. But what you have going on in The Wizard of Oz, and again, I'm just going to try to condense this as fast as possible. You're correct, Sean. You have the political allegory where you have, the gold standard is the yellow brick road, which leads to paper money, which is Emerald City. The Wizard of Oz is William McKinley, who was a Freemason. And you'll find this in the movie also, where the Scarecrow gets wisdom, the brain at the end, wisdom. And what's he do? He recites back the 47th proposition of Euclid back to the wizard, which is the Pythagorean theorem. which is the symbol of a Masonic worshipful master. And then you have, you write in the book, it's the silver slippers. This was changed to ruby, and of course this represents the free silver movement. And then of course you have the green-skinned witch, which is, you know, the evil side of paper money, which is inflation. And then of course you have the American farmer, who is the scarecrow. The laborer is Tin Man. Then the cowardly lion is McKinley's political opponents, which was Eugene Debs and Williams Jennings Bryan. And they were all bark, no bite. This is why they're a cowardly lion. And then you'll have, the Tin Man is the American laborer. He's immobile. This dealt with the depression and recession of 1896, where many laborers were laid off in a terrible depression and were immobile, unable to seek employment. What saved them was the oil companies, Standard Oil, Rockefeller, people like that, was able to get the laborer moving again. This is why Tin Man, in order to get him moving, has to get oiled up. This is a reference again to to Rockefeller, Standard Oil, things like that. So yeah, you're right. And again, I could go much more into this, but because of time constraint, you have this whole political allegory. But then, even on a deeper level with Wizard of Oz, you have basically this Gnostic concept of awakening and epiphany, where you have this farm girl, Dorothy Gale, and this is again very Freemasonic, taken up in the tornado. This would be the winding stairs of Freemasonry, the winding stairs of Solomon's Temple, to the Holy of Holies. And again, this ties into Royal Arch symbology, where she's transported to this magical land. And she's basically initiated into this mystery tradition. She goes on the golden path of religion, which leads to the false Messiah, which is what Theosophy warned about, that the modern day religions were worshiping what you corrected at the beginning of the show, the Gnostic demiurge, who is this lesser god, this lesser Messiah. And this, of course, is the Wizard of Oz, who is the false god who hides behind the veil, gains worship by fear and intimidation. And then, of course, Blavatsky said in her writings, in order to be initiated into gnosis, one had to have, courage, heart, and intelligence. Thus, Dorothy has three travelers or sojourners who want a brain, courage, and fortitude. So you have this tying in. And again, you have the golden path of enlightenment leading to the false god. And of course, the false god takes her back in a hot air balloon, symbolizing that, the religions of the world are hot air. There's nothing to them. So yeah, you have this entire, and then of course, Dorothy has the epiphany after going on the adventure that there's no place like home. This is her, Gnostic spiritual awakening, and then is of course transported back home with the esoteric wisdom that she learned on her adventure. But no one at home understands the adventure. No one understands her gnosis. No one understands her revelation or epiphany. They kind of make fun of her, but she knows better. So within the Wizard of Oz, I document it more in the book. This sort of Gnostic revelation, Gnostic epiphany, Gnostic, neo-Gnostic theme going on, theosophical theme going on in the Wizard of Oz. So within Wizard of Oz, you really have the three levels of symbology. You have the profane story, the adventure. Then you have the political allegory. Probably most people are becoming more cognizant of that one. And then third, most importantly, you have this, initiation into the ancient mysteries to receive enlightenment, wisdom, with Dorothy being the initiated, and of course has her epiphany, has her awakening. And I document this much more in the book. There's reasons why the two witches who help her of the North and South, the two witches who oppose her of the East and West, there's a reason for that. So yeah, this is definitely something I delve into more in the book. But yeah, you're correct. It's really these three levels of symbology going on in the Wizard of Oz.
It's maybe a broad question, but do you feel like ultimately, when you see symbolism in the films, and I think it's clear. There's symbolism in most Hollywood films at some level, whether it's an all-seeing eye, it's a pyramid in the background, it's a number 33, it's a 13, whatever it is. There's a lot of decisions, and do you believe across the board that these symbols, this sort of almost the ritual nature of a film, watching a film,
yes,
is ultimately designed to wake the profane, the ones who are not aware of this, to basically help them to recognize the things that are taking place beyond their certain surroundings? Or ultimately, is it more, is ultimately magic designed to sort of entertain, confuse, manipulate, but not ultimately to awaken?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's meant to entertain. I think, you look at a movie, I mean, what is it? You're going into a darkened theater, sitting in an aisle like a church-like setting to receive light, to receive, it's almost a form of, a religious experience. One could roughly argue. I mean, it may be a bit of a stretch, but if you think about it, it really isn't. I mean, movies have the power to make us laugh. I mean, I'm not trying to sound cliche here, but to affect us emotionally. I mean, like I said, it's really modern day mythology. I mean, it's a very powerful medium. I think I think in some cases they are meant to entertain us. I think these archetypes are used. I don't know if manipulation would be the right word, but I think in some cases they can be used to enlighten us, to perhaps try to awaken us. Masonry and the mystery traditions, one of their fundamental teachings is, and this is one of the reasons I wrote the book or wrote both books for that matter, is sort of to be informative, to recognize this material when you see it, because when you see it and you become cognizant of it, it's going to change the way you view things. I mean, it did for me anyway, and I think things that may have looked perfunctory before now have a much deeper meaning, and you're going to see why. That this stuff isn't a coincidence. Why this building, this corner, and this is just going into like Royal Arch. Why this building's cornerstone was laid on this date, and why this symbol is there, and why this is like this. And why the Erie Canal. The important symbolic Masonic rituals going on with this, and why the Federal District, has a Pythagorean right triangle in the heart of it, and why you'll find some of the architecture in Washington D.C. turning up in Baltimore. It's the same Freemasons that are doing it, and it's the same thing with movies. If you find out, why is this symbol being used here? In the context it's being used, I think it can be very enlightening. And what it's going to do is, what it's going to tell you is that these movies are really conveying a lot of material coming out of the mystery, the arcane mystery school / religions, relating to mythology, astrology, sorcery, Kabbalah, things of that nature. And I can't for once buy into the argument that this stuff is just a coincidence. I mean, I've just seen way too much of it, Sean. I mean, if I saw it once or twice or something like that, I'd maybe be able to just scratch my head and shrug it off. But I mean, even when this is something I talked about in cinema symbolism, and it's something I'm delving into more in cinema symbolism too, is you'll even find with these movies, I mean, you'll find the artwork associated with them a lot of times. And what I'm saying is, like, the movie posters have very arcane themes. I mean, and even in some cases, and the one that you can really document this is in the Omen movies, and really the third Omen movies, the release of the date. The actual date that the movie was released has astrological importance. I mean, so you just can't shrug this off and say, oh, this is just a coincidence. I mean, these people are know what they're doing. They're using this material. I don't necessarily go into the realm of that there's this evil, sinister force behind it. I mean, I think it's much more sublime than that, and I believe that it's used for informative purposes, and I think it's really, and it can even be a challenge. I mean, you watch a movie like, I've mentioned this before on other shows, and I'll just mention it briefly here, like Darren Aronofsky. And for me, watching his movies, something like Black Swan on a symbolic level, and I'm not kidding you when I say this, I really feel like I'm playing a game of symbolic chess against Bobby Fischer. I mean, he is just such a master of symbology and alchemy and symbolism and color, and I mean, it's just amazing the layers of symbology going on in that movie. And like I said, we're well beyond coincidence at this point. So, I mean, I really think it can be a form of enlightenment, caveated with it's meant to enlighten those who can see it. And that's really one of the motivations it was motivated me for writing my book.